The Pacific Ocean in the late 1930s was a stage set for a clash of titans, but beneath the surface of the rising tensions, a secret race for technological supremacy was reaching its boiling point. While the world's navies obsessed over the gargantuan caliber of battleship guns and the burgeoning potential of the aircraft carrier, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, was perfecting a silent, invisible equalizer. At the start of World War II, Japan possessed a naval weapon no other nation truly understood. It was a phantom that struck from the darkness, a weapon that defied the established laws of naval engagement. The Western powers, particularly the United States and Great Britain, operated under a specific set of tactical assumptions. They believed that torpedoes were short-range defensive weapons, tools to be used in the chaotic, close-quarters final stages of a battle. They assumed that any torpedo fired from more than 5 miles away was a wasted shot, easily dodged because of the telltale trail of white bubbles it left in its wake. They were wrong. Japan had developed the Type 93 torpedo. To the Allied sailors who would later witness their ships being disintegrated by explosions from an empty horizon, it would become known as the Long Lance. The Long Lance was an engineering marvel that stood in a category of its own. It was a massive 20-foot-long cylinder of destruction, 610 millimeters in diameter, carrying a warhead packed with nearly 1,000 pounds of Type 97 explosive, a volatile picric acid mixture. It was significantly faster than anything in the Allied arsenal, capable of screaming through the water at speeds exceeding 49 knots, an approximate speed of 56 miles per hour. It was longer range to an almost supernatural degree. While American torpedoes struggled to reach 6,000 yards, the Long Lance could travel over 22,000 yards at top speed and nearly 44,000 yards, over 20 miles at a cruising speed. It carried a warhead so powerful it could tear a heavy cruiser in half with a single contact. During the early battles of the Java Sea and Savo Island, Allied commanders were baffled. Their ships were exploding and sinking, yet there were no Japanese ships in sight, no periscopes visible, and no wakes to track. But inside the Japanese Navy, the Type 93 had a very different reputation. The Long Lance was born of a desperate strategic necessity. Japan knew it could never outproduce the industrial might of the United States. Their doctrine, known as Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, relied on attrition units, destroyers and cruisers that would strike the American fleet at night, whittling down their numbers with superior torpedoes before the battleships ever engaged. Because of this, the weapon was shrouded in a level of secrecy that bordered on the religious. Even within the IJN, most officers were kept in the dark about its true nature. Yet, among the crews of the destroyers and cruisers that carried them, the Long Lance wasn't just viewed as a tool of victory. It wasn't just feared by the enemy. It was feared by the men who launched it. To carry the Type 93 torpedo was to sail with a sleeping dragon strapped to your deck, a dragon that was as likely to consume its master as it was the foe. To understand why the Long Lance was so effective and so terrifyingly dangerous, one must look at the chemistry hidden within its steel skin. Every other navy in the world used compressed air to power their torpedo engines. When compressed air is burned with fuel, like kerosene, it creates steam to drive the turbines. But air is nearly 78% nitrogen. Nitrogen is an inert gas. It doesn't burn. Instead, it expands and is exhausted out the back of the torpedo, creating a vivid, foaming trail of bubbles on the surface. This wake acted as a giant arrow pointing directly back to the ship that fired it, and gave the target ship a chance to maneuver out of the way. Japan's engineers, led by Rear Admiral Kanenji Kishimoto and Captain Toshihide Asakuma, decided to use the unthinkable. Unlike Allied torpedoes, Japan's new weapon didn't use compressed air. It used pure oxygen. By eliminating nitrogen and using pure oxygen as the oxidizer, the Type 93 achieved astonishing advantages. No visible wake. Because the exhaust was almost entirely carbon dioxide, which is highly soluble in seawater, it dissolved before it could reach the surface. The Long Lance was a ghost torpedo, invisible even in the clear waters of the Pacific. Extreme speed.
Without the dead weight of nitrogen, the combustion was far more efficient and powerful, allowing for higher speeds. Unprecedented range. Pure oxygen allowed the engine to burn more fuel more efficiently, extending the distance the weapon could travel by 4 or 5 times the distance of its Western counterparts. But oxygen had a dark side. In its pure form, oxygen is not just a gas, it is a violent accelerant. It makes things that aren't normally flammable burn with explosive intensity. It reacts with oil, grease, and even the smallest impurities with catastrophic results. The Japanese engineers faced a nightmare. If they started the engine with pure oxygen, the sudden surge of the gas into the combustion chamber would cause an immediate catastrophic backfire. The engine would detonate before the torpedo even left the tube. To solve this, they created a complex multi-stage starting sequence. The torpedo would start its run using a small tank of ordinary compressed air. As the engine warmed up and reached a certain RPM, a series of delicate valves would slowly bleed in pure oxygen, gradually enriching the mixture until the nitrogen was phased out entirely. This process was a mechanical tightrope walk. A single spark in the wrong place, a tiny leak in the high-pressure lines, one careless valve turn by a nervous technician in the heat of battle. If the oxygen reached the fuel too early, or if there was a microscopic speck of grease in the oxygen lines, the torpedo wouldn't just fail, it would detonate inside the ship's own torpedo launcher. The sailors charged with maintaining these weapons lived in a state of constant low-level dread. They were essentially working in a bomb factory that was constantly pitching and rolling in the heavy seas. They called the oxygen the Great Flame, and they handled the charging tanks with a gentleness usually reserved for newborn infants. They knew that their greatest edge in battle was also a hair trigger that could send them to the bottom of the ocean without the enemy ever firing a shot. The development of the long lance was paid for in blood long before the first shot was fired in anger. During the secretive trials in the mid-1930s at the Kure Naval Arsenal and in the waters off the Izu Peninsula, the Japanese Navy learned the true cost of their miracle weapon. During these early tests, ships didn't sink from enemy fire, they exploded from within. The high-pressure oxygen flasks, pressurized over 3,000 pounds per square inch, were prone to spontaneous combustion if the internal piping wasn't surgically clean. In several instances during live fire drills, the transition from compressed air to pure oxygen failed. The resulting pre-ignition turned the torpedo tube into a giant pipe bomb. The results were haunting. Entire crews vanished in seconds as the midsection of destroyers were obliterated. Decks peeled upward like the skin of a fruit, and steel bulkheads, designed to withstand the pressure of the deep, folded like tissue paper under the heat and force of an internal oxygen explosion. The Japanese High Command was obsessed with secrecy to the point of insanity. When these accidents occurred, the areas were cordoned off. Dead sailors were buried in unmarked graves or listed as lost at sea during maneuvers. Official reports reached the desks of the Admiralty blaming mechanical anomalies or crew negligence, but the truth couldn't be completely suppressed. Among the tight-knit community of torpedo specialists, the rumors began to fester. They knew that the Type 93 was the most powerful weapon in the world, but they also knew that it was temperamental. Unofficially, sailors began whispering a nickname that would haunt the fleet throughout the war: the weapon that kills its owner. This fear wasn't just superstition, it changed the way Japanese captains fought. Unlike American destroyers, which would often hold their torpedoes for the perfect shot, Japanese crews were sometimes eager to get rid of them. In the heat of a surface engagement, a stray hit from an enemy's small-caliber gun, or even a nearby explosion, could ignite the oxygen tanks on the deck. A Japanese cruiser was a formidable opponent, but it was also a glass cannon. If an American shell struck the torpedo racks, the resulting secondary explosion of the long lances were often more devastating than the enemy shell itself. Several Japanese cruisers, including the Mikuma at the Battle of Midway and the Mogami, suffered horrific damage or were lost entirely because their own long lances turned into internal incendiaries. The Japanese Navy had created a silent killer that could reach out and touch an enemy from beyond the horizon. They had achieved the dream of every naval strategist, the ability to strike without being seen. But in doing so, They had violated a fundamental rule of warfare. They had built a weapon that was so efficient, so powerful, and so volatile that it demanded a level of perfection that human beings, in the chaos of war, could rarely provide.
As the war progressed and the skilled technicians of the pre-war Navy were replaced by less experienced recruits, the great flame of the oxygen torpedo became an even greater liability. The weapon that was supposed to win the war for the emperor ended up becoming a symbol of the Japanese military's fatal flaw, a willingness to sacrifice their own men on the altar of a technological miracle that was never as stable as it was lethal. The long lance remains a testament to a time when engineering pushed past the boundaries of safety, creating a weapon that changed the world, but only at the cost of the men who were brave enough, or unlucky enough, to pull the trigger. The perfection of the Type 93 long lance was not achieved in laboratories, but through a brutal, often lethal process of trial and error in the open sea. Between 1935 and 1941, while the rest of the world looked toward the horizon for signs of Japanese expansion, a series of catastrophic failures was occurring within the Imperial Japanese Navy's, IJN's, own training grounds. The pattern was always the same. A group of destroyers would head out for nighttime maneuvers, their torpedo tubes loaded with the experimental Type 93s. These were live-fire exercises conducted under conditions of extreme realism, high speed, sharp turns, and heavy spray. Suddenly, without warning and without a single shot being fired by a mock enemy, a destroyer would be engulfed in a pillar of white-hot flame. The blasts were not conventional. They were high-pressure oxygen explosions, far more violent than a simple gunpowder flare-up. In a fraction of a second, the oxygen flasks, pressurized to nearly 200 kilograms, would fail, often due to a microscopic contaminant. If a single drop of lubricating oil or a speck of organic debris found its way into the oxygen lines, the resulting chemical reaction was instantaneous and unstoppable. The torpedoes, armed for the exercise but not yet launched, became the ship's executioners. The result was usually the total loss of the ship. The midsection of a Fubuki or Kagero-class destroyer would simply vanish, the keel snapping like a dry twig. Because the oxygen fueled the fire, the heat was intense enough to melt the very steel of the bulkheads, turning the vessel into a sinking furnace. The veil of silence. For the families of the sailors who vanished in these accidents, the cruelty of the weapon was matched only by the cruelty of the state. Families were told nothing. There were no ceremonies, no honorary mentions in the newspapers, and no explanations. To admit a ship had been lost to its own equipment would be to reveal the secret of the oxygen propulsion, a secret the Naval General Staff protected with religious fervor. Records of these losses were sealed in the deepest vaults of the Kure Naval District. Survivors, those few lucky enough to be blown clear into the water before the ship went down, were reassigned to remote outposts in the Kuril Islands or the South Pacific. They were ordered, under penalty of death for treason, never to speak of what they had seen. The philosophy of the IJN was clear. The weapon worked perfectly in combat, but only if it didn't kill you first. This was the cult of the offensive taken to its logical, terrifying extreme. The lives of a few hundred sailors were considered a small price to pay for a weapon that could theoretically sink an American battleship from 20 miles away. As the war in the Pacific began in earnest, the legend of the Long Lance grew among the Allied forces, but a different kind of legend was circulating among the Japanese destroyer captains. These were the men who had to live with the weapon every day, and they knew the thin line between a tactical advantage and a floating death trap. Despite the rigid discipline of the Imperial Japanese Navy, some captains quietly resisted orders. This was a silent mutiny, born of self-preservation and a deep sense of responsibility towards their crews. They recognized that the Type 93 was a glass cannon of the highest order. Tactics of avoidance. These commanders utilized several methods to mitigate the risk, often at the risk of their own careers. Delayed loading. Official doctrine required torpedoes to be fully oxygenated and ready for launch long before entering a combat zone. Some captains waited until the last possible second, knowing that every minute the oxygen was under pressure increased the chance of a catastrophic leak. Reduced payload. While a destroyer might have the capacity for 16 torpedoes, 8 in the tubes and 8 spares, some captains would only carry the primary load. They knew that the reload lockers were essentially unarmored bomb bays sitting directly above the engine rooms. Ignoring aggressive doctrines.
The Naval General Staff pushed for long-range saturation fire, where dozens of torpedoes were fired at extreme ranges based on mathematical probability. Some captains ignored this, preferring to keep their torpedoes in the tubes until they were close enough to guarantee a hit, reducing the time the volatile weapons were exposed to vibration and shock. Not because they doubted the torpedo's power, they had seen it tear target ships apart in seconds, but because they knew what it could do below deck. They had seen the scorched paint on the torpedo tubes after a minor leak. They had heard the ominous hiss of escaping gas during a storm. One destroyer commander wrote privately in his journal, a document found only after his death. The Americans have their 5-inch guns, and the sea has its storms, but I fear our own torpedoes more than enemy guns. We are sailors sitting upon a volcano, praying the Emperor's luck holds the valves shut. This psychological toll created a strange tension on the bridge of Japanese warships. At the very moment a captain should be focused on the enemy, he was often looking over his shoulder at his own torpedo deck, waiting for the spark that would end his ship's life. The very danger that made the Type 93 a liability also became its greatest strength. Because the weapon was so lethal to handle, the Japanese Navy was forced to develop a level of training and night discipline that was unparalleled in the world. Japanese crews trained relentlessly to handle the oxygen torpedoes. They operated in total darkness, learning to feel the vibrations of the valves and the temperature of the lines by touch alone. This hellish training, Geikun, turned Japanese destroyer squadrons into the most proficient night fighting force in naval history. While Allied navies relied on early, unreliable radar, the Japanese relied on superb optics and the silent, wakeless death of the Longlance. The devastation of the night. In the chaotic night battles of 1942 and 1943, Savo Island, the Java Sea, and the waters around Guadalcanal, the Longlance was devastating. Allied commanders, unaware that a torpedo could travel 20 miles without leaving a bubble trail, often thought they were being hit by their own ships or by mysterious internal failures. Cruisers sunk without warning. At the Battle of Savo Island, the Allied fleet was decimated in a matter of minutes. Heavy cruisers like the USS Quincy and the HMS Canberra were struck by torpedoes they never saw coming. Battleships crippled. Even the massive hulls of Allied battleships were not immune. The sheer explosive power of the Type 93's 400-kilogram warhead could blow holes in anti-torpedo bulges that were designed to stop smaller, air-powered weapons. Allied confusion. American and British commanders were frequently confused, panicked, and overwhelmed. They would search the sea for periscopes, assuming a submarine attack, while the Japanese destroyers were actually miles away, already turning for home. The same weapon that terrified Japanese sailors, the one that had claimed so many of their brothers in unexplained training accidents, nearly broke the back of the Allied fleets in the Pacific. It was a weapon of extreme contradictions, a masterpiece of engineering that was fundamentally flawed, a strategic miracle that was a tactical nightmare. The Longlance proved that in total war, the most effective weapon is often the one that demands the most from its users. The Japanese Navy's willingness to embrace the unthinkable gave them a 2-year window of naval superiority, but it came at a price that would eventually haunt them. As the war progressed and the elite, highly trained crews were lost, the great flame of the oxygen torpedo would once again turn its wrath upon its owners, proving that no amount of courage can fully tame a weapon that burns with the intensity of pure, unbridled oxygen.
As the calendar turned to 1944, the sun began to set on the Imperial Japanese Navy. The strategic landscape had shifted from the aggressive, wide-ranging carrier strikes of the early war to a desperate, defensive struggle for survival. The Long-Lance torpedo, once the vanguard of Japanese naval supremacy, was now entering its most dangerous phase, not for the Americans, but for the Japanese sailors who still clung to the hope of a decisive battle. The conditions at sea had deteriorated into a nightmare of logistics and attrition. The American submarine blockade was a tightening noose around the home islands, cutting off the flow of high-grade lubricants, specialized spare parts, and, most critically, refined fuel. The decay of the machine. The Type 93 was a weapon that demanded clinical perfection. In the early years, the torpedo technicians were the elite of the elite, men who had spent years mastering the delicate oxygen enrichment valves and the high-pressure seals. But by 1944, those veterans were largely gone, lost in the jungles of Guadalcanal or at the bottom of the Iron Bottom Sound. They were replaced by green crews, boys rushed through training centers where the instruction was hurried and the safety protocols were often whispered rather than practiced. The technical reality of pure oxygen, O2, is unforgiving. Under the immense pressures required for the long lance, upwards of 3,000 psi, the gas ceases to behave like the air we breathe. It becomes a volatile, aggressive oxidant. If a technician's hand was sweaty, or if a microscopic film of oil remained on a wrench during a maintenance cycle, the oxygen would find it. In the humid, salt-sprayed environment of a destroyer's deck, maintenance became impossible. Ships were forced to remain at sea for months without proper refit. The high-pressure flasks, designed to be checked and purged regularly, began to develop micro-stress fractures. The gaskets, meant to be replaced after every exercise, were reused until they cracked. The floating bombs. More internal explosions followed, often occurring in the dead of night when the ships were merely cruising. There are accounts from late war survivors of destroyers suddenly disappearing in a flash of blue-white light, the signature color of an oxygen fire. No enemy aircraft were in the area, no submarine pings were detected. The ships simply unmade themselves from the inside out. Even more terrifying was the sympathetic detonation. In the early war, Japanese cruisers like the Mogami and the Chokai were marvels of firepower. But by 1944, their massive torpedo banks were their greatest vulnerability. At the Battle of Samar, several Japanese heavy cruisers were neutralized or sunk not by American torpedoes, but by a single lucky hit from a small caliber 5-inch gun or a stray bomb. When an American shell struck the torpedo tubes, it didn't just cause a fire, it initiated a high-pressure oxygen explosion that acted like a shaped charge, driving the blast downward through the deck and into the ships of idols. Ships that should have survived a hit were instead gutted by their own miracle weapons. By late 1944, a quiet, almost treasonous order began to circulate among the surviving destroyer captains: limit oxygen torpedo deployment whenever possible. Some ships began to fill their oxygen tanks with ordinary compressed air, sacrificing the range and stealth of the long lance for the simple, basic security of not blowing up. The Navy no longer trusted its own masterpiece. The dragon they had spent a decade taming had finally turned its head, and its breath was incinerating the hand that fed it. For in the final accounting of history, the Type 93 Long Lance stands as the perfect symbol of the Imperial Japanese war effort. It was a weapon of extreme highs and devastating lows, reflecting a culture that valued spirit, sation, as much as steel. It helped Japan dominate the early Pacific War, creating a torpedo terror that haunted Allied sailors from the Java Sea to the Solomons. It rewrote naval tactics, proving that the night belonged to the side that could strike first and strike from the shadows. It sank legendary ships, the USS Hornet, the USS Northampton, the HMS Perth, ships whose crews never saw the blow that killed them. The hidden cost. But the cost of that dominance was etched into the very hulls of the Japanese fleet. The Long Lance killed Japanese sailors in peacetime during secret tests that were never officially acknowledged. It destroyed ships from the inside when mechanical failures or enemy fire turned the deck into a pressurized furnace. It haunted the sleep of thousands of men who lived in cramped berths just a few feet away from thousands of pounds of high-pressure oxygen and picric acid. It was a weapon too advanced, too dangerous, and ultimately too unforgiving. It required a perfect world, perfect maintenance, perfect fuel, and perfect crews to function. And in the chaotic, grinding reality of a world war, perfection is the first thing to vanish. Imperial Japan bet its naval future on a technological miracle,
They achieved that miracle, but in doing so, they created a machine that reflected their own fatal flaw, an absolute commitment to victory that left no room for the survival of their own people. The long lance was brilliant engineering, yes, but it was engineering without a conscience. As we look back at the rust-colored remains of these torpedoes in museums today, we see more than just a weapon. We see a testament to a time when a nation's reach exceeded its grasp, and when the price of perfection was paid in the lives of the very men who were told the weapon was their salvation. The long lance remains a ghost of the Pacific, a silent, invisible killer that serves as a permanent reminder that in war, the most dangerous weapon is often the one you carry yourself.